Okay, so I'm just going to talk about a bit about Wi-Fi and some basics that you might not know about, or you might know already. So let's start with RF basics. So,
You've got one.
yep. Okay. So RF stands for radio frequency, and radio frequency is just the way that data is transmitted. So Wi-Fi is transmitted over RF. Typically, you can view this as a sine wave. So if you've been to school, you've got sine and cosine. If you put an RF frequency through an oscilloscope, then this is kind of what it looks like. So you've got the amplitude here. The amplitude is the amount of power that is sent. And then you've also got the wavelength. And so the wavelength is how long the wave is at a 360 degree. So when it goes down and up, that's 360 degrees because it does a full circle, right? So the wavelength kind of dictates what the frequency is and whether it's 2.4 or 5 gigahertz. Yeah, as I said before, every time there is a cycle, that is an actual wavelength. And then we've got frequency. So lower frequencies tend to be longer and wider, whereas high frequencies tend to be a lot shorter. The number of frequencies is based on like how fast or what something is. So if you've got a 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi, that means it's doing a frequency cycle 2.4 billion times in a second, whereas 5 gigahertz is actually 5 billion times in a second. So it's very quick. It does require a lot more power. So the higher the frequency, the more power it uses. How does this look in terms of data? So at a simple level, it's all binary, right? So you've got bits of 1 and 0. Back in the day, there was amplitude shift keying. So what that means is it changes the amount of power to change the signal. And when it changes the signal, it kind of figures out it's going to be a 1 or a 0. Anyone know what AM, a good example of what AM is? So AM radio is a way of amplitude modulation. So that uses ASK, which is amplitude shift keying. The other one is frequency shift keying. So that changes the frequency of the wave. And FM radio is a great example of what FM looks like. And then the last one, so this is phase modulation. The difference of phase modulation is to change the wave. So you've got this constant wave going up and down, but then if you change the wave to just 90 degrees, it changes the bit rate. It'll recognize that it could be a 1 or a 0. So phase shift is quite new, and the most recent way of modulating or sending data is called quadrature amplitude modulation. And what this is the combination of the amplitude and phase shift. So it combines those techniques together, and then it gives you this kind of constellation chart. And so what happens is the frequency will hit one of these and determine like how much data it can send. So this is part of a coding scheme. So I want to talk about Wi-Fi operation. So 2.4 gigahertz, there are 14 channels. Most countries use 13. There is a 14th channel, but nobody tends to use it. These channels overlap. So when things overlap, you get interference, right? Wi-Fi works by using an algorithm called collision avoidance. So in a switch uses collision detection. It goes through a switch fabric, and the switch will detect when packets are coming in and going out. So the way the switch works is it detects that, and it'll stop frames from coming in, and stop frames from going out, and it's kind of like a traffic controller, right? So it stops collisions, basically. In Wi-Fi, it's quite different. So in Wi-Fi, there's no traffic controller. So there's no way to control how the traffic comes in and out. So what happens is all the devices are made to avoid traffic. So if there's someone broadcasting, a client will wait for that broadcast to finish before it transmits. And this happens in like nanoseconds, so it's really quick. But a Wi-Fi device, like a typical Wi-Fi router, can only send to one device at a time. It doesn't send to multiple devices at the same time. But it happens so quickly, it seems like it's sending to every device, right? But in reality, it's just sending to one device. So yeah, that's collision avoidance. So there's two types of interference. You've got co-channel interference and adjacent interference. Adjacent channel interference is when there are devices that are on the same overlapping frequency. So typically you want to have them spaced out so that they don't overlap. But if there is overlapping, then that's called adjacent interference. Co-channel interference, on the other hand, is when you have devices on the same band. So even like two phones connecting to the same AP, you could consider that co-channel interference. They're actually not interfering with each other. It's just the more devices that are connected on the same channel, the longer it has to wait, right? So these devices are waiting to connect to the router or to receive information from the Wi-Fi device. So if you were to design a 2.4 gig network, you'd want to have channels spaced out, and you'd want to make sure that there are non-overlapping channels. There are only 3 non-overlapping channels in 2.4 gig today, and that's 1, 6, and 11. So this is kind of an example of what you'd want to do if you had this many APs. You'd want to separate them by their channels, and you'd want to space them out so that they don't interfere. So these aren't overlapping, but these can because they're not actually overlapping. They're different channels. Cool, let's talk about MIMO. So MIMO is multiple in, multiple out. This is what it looks like on a device. When you go to a shop and you see like MIMO, it'll advertise this little string here. This is the number of receivers, the number of transmitters, and number of streams. What this means, so Matt here is, if Matt was an access point,
Thanks.
He's got 2 ears, right? So he's got 2 receivers, but he's only got 1 mouth. So he's only got 1 transmitter, and he's only 1 person. So there's only 1 stream. But with MIMO, they use these techniques to combine streams together. And so when you combine streams together, you can get double your throughput. So if you've got a stream of, say, 40 megahertz, and that's giving you a 150 megabit throughput, if you had 2 streams, you'd double that. So you would get 300 megabit. And if you had 3 streams, you'd get 450 megabits.
So how do we do multiple streams, though?
So there are more antennas in a router. Early on, so I think in Wi-Fi AC, so Wi-Fi 5 or 802.11ac, they introduced MIMO. Was it N?
N was MIMO, yeah.
Yeah, so N was when they introduced single user MIMO. So that means a client with more antennas could receive multiple streams coming in. The newer standard that came out in 802.11ac Wave 2 is called multiple user MIMO. So that means the Wi-Fi access point can send to multiple devices at the same time. So remember when I said before that a Wi-Fi device can only send to 1 device at a time, and it kind of cycles that. So with multi-user MIMO, it can send to up to 2 or 3, depending on how many streams it supports.
What's the maximum amount of streams one can have?
So currently, the highest end devices can do 8 by 8. The position of your phone or your device is quite important. The AP will actually detect how you're holding your device and transmit it in that way. So it's pretty cool stuff. Cool. So yeah, 2.4 gig, there's only 100 megahertz of total spectrum, which doesn't give you a lot to play with, and that's why there's only like 14 channels max. 5 gigahertz, on the other hand, has 600 megahertz of total spectrum. It is shorter range, so the wavelength is shorter, so it means it can't travel as far. It'll attenuate faster. Whereas 2.4 gig will, it can go through walls a lot better. It can reach further because the wavelength is longer. So here's some examples of 2.4 and 5. Fun fact is 5 gigahertz came out before 2.4 gig. So Wi-Fi was first launched at 5 gigahertz at like 54 megabits per second. And when 2.4 came out shortly after, it only did 11 megabits. So it was quite slow. And then further standards, made it go up to 54 megabits. And now we can do 1 gigabit over Wi-Fi 5. So some cool stuff there. Cool, let's talk about channel width. So just remember there are only 14 channels on 2.4 gig. And these are the channels that don't overlap. One channel is 20 megahertz, so that's the amount of bandwidth that you can get. Whereas 2 channels could be 40 megahertz if you combine it. But typically, if you're designing a Wi-Fi network, you want to use 3 channels because more channels is less contention on the airspace. So it is possible to bond the channels together. So you can tell an access point to say use 40 megahertz channel, which will double your bandwidth for that particular access point. But that means it takes up 66% of the airspace, which means you can realistically only have one channel, right? So that's not great. 5 gig on the other hand. So 5 gigahertz, you've got a lot more channels to play with. None of the channels at 5 gigahertz overlap. So you can pick any channel and they won't overlap. The only thing you don't want to do is pick the same channel on your neighboring access point, right? That gives us a lot of bandwidth to play with, which means we can bond the channels together, right? We can get a 40 megahertz channel. We can get 80 megahertz channel, so you can have up to 5 80 megahertz channel, 6. And now we have 160 megahertz channel. So with the latest Wi-Fi 6 standard, you can have 160 megahertz in a single channel, which can give you like 1 gig throughput.
And so the advantage of doubling the channel width, it means we get more throughput, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So coming soon on the horizon is 6 gigahertz. So Wi-Fi 6 is not 6 gigahertz, it's still 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. There is a new standard coming out called Wi-Fi 6E. So Wi-Fi 6E introduces the 6 gigahertz spectrum. This has been launched in America, and the Radio Spectrum Management, which is like the government body for radio in New Zealand, they've done a paper or proposal last year in June for 6 gigahertz. So it hasn't come out yet. It hasn't been approved yet. They've done a call out to like all the big companies out there to say, we're interested in releasing 6 gigahertz spectrum. And it's pretty much just watch this space at this point. Keep in mind that when it does come out, the current proposal for 6 gigahertz is only this amount of spectrum here, so 4925 to 6425. So we're not getting the whole thing. America has the whole thing, but other countries are considering just this amount of bandwidth here. Yeah.
And so it's worthwhile keeping in mind, so they're considering the lower 500 megahertz of bandwidth, When you look at the 5 gigahertz, go back to this slide, the 5 gigahertz channels we use today also consume 500 megahertz worth of bandwidth. And so when 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi comes on, it'll provide us another 500 megahertz of bandwidth that we can use. So we'll have basically the channels that are available on 5 gig, that amount of channels will be available again to us in the 6 gigahertz spectrum.
What are the theoretical speeds of
6 gigahertz. So at the moment, you can use a 160 megahertz channel, which will give you like, 1.3
or something like that?
I've done a throughput speed test with 1.5 gig on an Ookla speed test. So that's including like packet overhead and stuff. So that's just a single device using 160 megahertz. Nobody else in the area. So there was no interference. But that's at 5 gigahertz. So with 6 gigahertz, there'll be even less interference because it's a lot shorter. But you've got 3 of these to play with. There is also Wi-Fi 7, which is kind of on the horizon. And it uses 6 gigahertz, and it'll allow you to combine 2 of these channels. So you can have 320 megahertz, which is even faster.
At what point will we get past multi-gig 2.5?
Wi-Fi 7. We're past multi-gig. Yeah, we're up to 10 gigabit at Wi-Fi 7. Yep.
Yeah. Cool. So this is just about placement and what you'd kind of do in a classroom. Typically, you'd have your access point mounted face down, and I don't
Kind of like that. Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Perfect.
Good example. Yeah. So what's that called? L bracket.
Yep.
So this is an L bracket, and the reason why it's this way is because it's an omnidirectional antenna, and it broadcasts the frequency in a sphere, right? And you'd want to have, this is above our heads, so anything below is going to get a decent signal. If we were to mount it like against the wall, that's also good, but it's going to go that way, and in that kind of spherical direction. Anything behind this access point won't get a good signal. So if you do it this way, it'll broadcast in that kind of spherical direction. Yeah.
It's a common question, right? A lot of schools ask us, should you put the access point on the L bracket, or why can't we just put the access point directly on the wall? And so I think we've found that over a period of years, the L bracket provides the most flexibility in terms of, if you put an AP in this classroom, you guarantee the surrounding classrooms get coverage. Whereas if we put a vertically mounted AP on the wall, if there was a classroom behind us, it's not going to get great coverage. And so the primary use for the L bracket is to provide that 360-degree coverage. But obviously, if there was someone above us in the second story, they're not going to be receiving good signal from that AP. But that no one really expects that to happen anyway. We'd probably have a different set of APs on the second floor. And so that's the primary reason that the L bracket's used. But a fun fact that the L bracket's not actually a Ruckus product. At Ruckus, we don't make an L bracket. So that a lot of schools are using the bracket, which is supplied by our distributor, which is manufactured somewhere in Auckland. Yeah.
A bit complicated to make, is it?
For us, we do have a bunch of mounting brackets, but yeah, I mean, in a lot of scenarios, we actually prefer customers to put their AP like on a ceiling tile. And the APs actually have built-in clips. You don't even need a bracket. So we have, actually this one I tell a lie, but a lot of the other ones have a built-in clip where you don't need a bracket. But we have a plastic mount that comes in the box that allows the AP to attach to a rail on the ceiling tile.
So when you said before about the antennas in there being horizontal and vertical, then,
yeah.
So why would that make a difference? Why would you need to mount it that way if you had both antennas?
Yeah, it doesn't make a difference if you have both antennas, but some products on the market, actually this guy, the small guy we put in hotel rooms, only has vertically polarized antennas. So it all depends on the product. Yeah.
So this is a scenario where if you've got an exam happening and you want to put all the students in a big room, this is kind of like the ideal situation of how you'd want to put your access points. You could actually also have like one access point in the middle, but the problem with that is if you need a certain amount of bandwidth, the middle access point, all the clients here are going to start connecting to that middle access point because it's a lot closer, right? So it's kind of in best practice to mount them against the wall and have them so that the clients are only, you're limiting the amount of clients and you're kind of load balancing the clients to the APs. Yeah. And then the other thing to consider is, like in this kind of example, you're probably going to put them in a big school hall, and getting the APs in the middle is actually going to be quite difficult because it's like this massive thing. That school hall is probably used for basketball as well, and so you probably don't want it dangling, and that's why it's a lot easier to just mount them against the walls.
And the aim of the game is to try and get the access points as close as possible to the end user, and that provides us two things. Getting the AP really close means we've got great signal, which means that throughput's going to be better. The other aspect of this as well is if I've got a number of access points in a large room, the decision as to which access point a client device joins is made by the client. It's not made by the Wi-Fi infrastructure. And so normally what will happen is if I have my iPad and it wants to connect to Wi-Fi, it will normally connect to the strongest signal it can find. But if I have multiple access points in a room and they're all appearing fairly strong, there's a bit of black magic built into the driver of the operating system of the client device, and no one really knows how it works, right? So, for example, on an Apple device, like the people who wrote the code are the only people that know the exact logic. But what we know for sure is these days, devices try to prefer 5 gigahertz, and they'll try to connect to the strongest thing that they find. So that's generally speaking true. The other thing is if you have a really old device, I don't know, from like 2001 or something, and you haven't updated its Wi-Fi driver in some time, then you might find that that device will prefer connecting to 2.4 gig. And so the really important thing is to make sure that our Wi-Fi drivers on our devices are kept up to date, especially with Wi-Fi 6. It's a big thing.
Yep. Cool. Any other questions? I think we're done.